The Social Responsibility of Business, Milton Frieman. In the previous chapter, we discussed the issues surrounding the debate as to whether corporations should be treated as actual persons. So, on one side, there were those who argued that corporations were moral persons that had the same rights and responsibilities and obligations as living, breathing persons. And others argued that, in fact, corporations aren't persons and ought not to be treated as persons. In this chapter, we'll be looking at questions of corporate action and setting aside for a moment the question of whether the corporation should be viewed as a person or a pseudo-person or as an agent or as some sort of just legal fiction. So in Milton Friedman's article, the question we're going to be asking is, do corporations or do corporate CEOs owe anything toward the public good? In other words, should corporations engage in social action of some sort? What Milton Frieman, who happens to be a Nobel-winning economist, argues is that the corporation's only moral responsibility is to the interests of their stockholders or the members of the board. So a corporate charter and the corporate duty is simply to make money for those who have invested in the corporation. Anything outside of that, so any sort of philanthropy or donations to various causes or setting up some sort of social service through the corporation, would be an illegitimate use of corporate assets and would in fact be morally wrong, according to Friedman. Now, of course, he has to back this up, for many of us believe, for instance, that corporations do owe something to society. As we saw in The Corporation, that is the documentary The Corporation, there are things called externalities. There are costs that businesses and corporations put onto others that are not part of a particular transaction. So the question is, since corporations benefit from those externalities, wouldn't it be the case, or shouldn't it be the case, that they owe something back to society? And Friedman's argument is going to be that no, in fact, they don't. And in fact, it's a dangerous sort of idea to have corporations engaging in some sort of social philanthropy or social good. Corporate social responsibility. As was mentioned previously, Friedman does not believe that corporations should engage in socially responsible action. In other words, businesses should not attempt to change the social circumstances, but should simply work within the framework of existing laws. So long as a business does not commit fraud, conducting business in a society is an exercise of our natural right to liberty. For Friedman, natural rights are generally understood to be those entitlements that are held to obtain independent of any sort of voluntary agreement on the part of others. So in essence, Friedman believes that our liberty rights, our freedom rights in a society, grant us the right to do business. So as long as I'm not committing fraud, I'm not overtly harming anyone, then my liberty rights protect me against being required to do things for the benefit of society or the direct benefit of society. So as he mentioned before, my main goal as a business owner is to make more money for my stockholders or my shareholders. And that's the job I'm supposed to be doing. I'm not supposed to be doing social outreach programs or provide social services. Those things go beyond what I'm supposed to do. And in part, the reason I don't have to do these other things is that those are an infringement on my liberty. To say that I have to do certain social things, provide certain social benefits to individuals or to the community, is to infringe upon my liberty. That is, to do what I want to do. Corporate responsibility continued. Had Friedman's argument ended at a right or a natural right to liberty, that is, to a negative right, in this case, not to be interfered with in cases of contractual agreements with others or exchanges with others, then we might think that perhaps Friedman is missing something. But in this case, Friedman isn't just making the case that liberty is the only reason businesses shouldn't be compelled to act altruistically. He also believes that corporations acting out of self-interest is actually in the interest of everyone else. So, on Friedman's account, acting self-interestedly, acting egoistically, makes everyone else better off. So, making as much money as possible for shareholders leads to a good social environment. In essence, he's saying something like this: negative rights are there, especially the negative right to liberty, to protect others from intruding on my personal affairs. So, as a business owner or as a corporate CEO, I should be left alone to engage in voluntary transactions with others. I manufacture my product, sell it to others who voluntarily buy the product, and so forth. Now, my goal is to sell as much of this product as possible to make as much money as possible. Now, if it was just that, if it was just the self-interest in making money, you might say, well, isn't something missing? But what Friedman argues is that by my company making money, by me making money for the shareholders, this leads to people having more money, which means they can exercise their liberty the way they want to exercise their liberty. And so it's not just that the corporation ought to act self-interestedly because the corporation wants to make money. Acting self-interestedly has the side benefit of increasing the overall social good. So it's not only a rights argument, but the value of the right in part comes from the third-party effects, the effects that it has on others. So Friedman thinks that if we allow corporations to simply look at the bottom line, that this will be a benefit for everyone. And so this further bolsters his argument that corporations shouldn't be required to give up some of their profit or to engage in sort of social action in some sense. Corporate social responsibility as a threat to freedom. Friedman notes another problem with holding corporations socially responsible. Now remember, when we're talking about the social responsibility of corporations, we're saying the actions that corporations ought to take outside of simply the legal business transaction that they're engaged in. So what Friedman says, or what Friedman asks, is how can self-selected private individuals determine what is in the best interest of society? And the quote on page 349, 350 is instructive here. If businessmen are civil servants rather than employees of their stockholders, then in a democracy they will, sooner or later, be chosen by the public techniques of election and appointment. So what he's arguing is that if we start to hold corporations responsible for social welfare, that those individuals are no longer business people, but now have become some sort of civil servant. So he thinks that the natural outcome of this is that business people will have to be chosen by election if we hold businesses accountable. Now, of course, the question is whether this is a non sequitur. Can I hold corporations responsible or socially responsible for some things? Can I require that corporations do socially good works with some of their profits without this sort of devolving into socialism? So he says, eventually all decision making will be done by the government, which is equivalent to socialism. So you can see how this happens. You have this freedom to do business. I've now infringed upon your freedom to do business and to engage in these voluntary transactions. And now I'm requiring that you do certain things that benefit society, whatever sort of social services that Friedman has in mind, what he thinks corporations would be responsible for doing. So we see this at sometimes. Corporations, in order to receive tax breaks, will be required to invest in schools. So while they might be given a tax break on some of their property value, some of it also has to go to the schools. People will call for corporations to set up nonprofit entities to study various things or to fix the environment or something along those lines, even though they can't be tied directly to the social ill that they're trying to rectify. And so what Friedman says, if you start making corporations do these sorts of things, eventually one might ask, well, in a democracy, isn't the government supposed to provide those sort of social services? And so what you've essentially done is taken over the private sector and made that private sector partially public, which is socialism. Socialism is where the government controls at least some of the means of production. Inefficiencies of a centrally controlled economy. Building on his argument that holding corporates socially responsible would end up socializing corporations, Friedman argues that let's assume for a minute that you didn't think socialism was so bad. So perhaps that's exactly what we ought to do. and after all, in the past, we have socialized various industries. So for some time, the electrical industry, in many places, was socialized. So why not socialize the economy? Why not take these large corporations and hold them accountable in this way? Well, it says once we do that, what normally happens and what historically has happened in socialist and communist societies are things like product shortages, labor shortages, gray markets, black markets, and the rationing of goods. What normally happens under state-controlled economies is that they're extremely inefficient. Normally they're going for 100% employment, or as close as 100% employment as possible, so that's excluding those who are retired or too young to work. And as a consequence of that, oftentimes you find things like inflation. You find inefficiency. You find more people working in a job that requires less people to actually do the job. And so these sorts of price controls and this taking over of the economy, argues Friedman, would lead us to the end of the free market system. And he believes, as an economist and as a free market economist, that this would be a bad thing. And I think to some extent he's probably right about this, that if we had too much control of industry, if we didn't allow businesses to be aggressive, if we didn't allow competition and exchange, some of this could occur. So his argument is that once you start to limit individual liberty, then you're now holding business people accountable as civil servants. Now you're democratizing corporations. Once you've gone to the level of democratizing corporations, then you've now actually changed the nature of the entire system to a more socialistic system. And once you get to that socialistic system, the next sort of step in that progression is an end to the free market system altogether. Corporate charity. Given what Friedman has said about the moral responsibility of corporations to their shareholders, when a corporation gives to a charity, it's actually an inappropriate use of corporate funds. After all, any profits that a corporation makes are supposed to go back to their shareholders. So when a corporation gives to a charity, it's actually taking money out of the pockets of shareholders and giving it to someone who does not have an interest in the corporation. So individual shareholders should determine what they wish to give to charitable organizations. So again, this builds on what Friedman said in the past. By businesses doing well and giving their shareholders a good return on their investment, those shareholders now have money to give to those sort of charitable organizations that they deem worthy. Now, Friedman doesn't say, of course, that corporations can never contribute to charitable organizations, but they must receive some benefit from that charity. So, for example, tax breaks, maybe public relations. A number of corporations, Exxon, for instance, when the Exxon Valdez had spilled its oil up and around Alaska, what Exxon would do is give to a number of charitable groups, would sponsor a number of charitable or environmental causes. Well, why did they do this? Was this a good use of the corporate funds? Well, they were giving away shareholder money, but the idea was that by giving away some of this money to various causes, they would get a better name for themselves, a positive image, which would mean people would go back to the pumps. And in fact, Exxon felt the negative impact of the oil spill. And so companies like this will often then give money to sort of bolster their image to the public. Friedman thinks that's a perfectly legitimate use of corporate funds. If I get a good tax break, if there's a tax purpose to this, if there's a public relations reason or argument that can be made for doing some sort of charitable action, then, according to Friedman, that's a responsible use of corporate funds. But simply giving to charities, setting up some sort of social service through the corporation, is actually not an appropriate use of corporate funds.